What's up guys, and welcome back to Training Basics, where I cover all of the essential information you need to know to succeed on your lifting journey. Today's episode will answer one of the most heavily debated questions in the fitness industry: how hard should you train? Now, as opposed to just jumping straight into a conclusion, I'll first give you a brief overview on sets and reps to explain what makes both a set and rep meaningful. Then I'll talk about effective reps and reps in reserve and how the two impact hypertrophy. And finally, I'll finish off with training to failure versus training close to failure, the difference between them, and the pros and cons of both. So as a quick refresher, a rep is basically when you perform one exercise one time by stretching and contracting your muscle fibers, and a set is just a series of reps all performed in succession. Now, as I mentioned multiple times throughout this series, in order for a set to actually be productive and lead to muscle growth, it needs to be taken close to failure. That means regardless of how many reps you choose to perform in a set, once you finish it, you shouldn't have been able to get many more. So if you casually just waltz into the gym and do 12 reps of bicep curls thinking it's good for hypertrophy, when realistically you could have done 25, you're not doing yourself any good, as you're just not training with any intensity. Sure, you may have done 12 reps, but because you stopped your set 13 reps shy of failure, none of those reps you performed were actually meaningful. So in that case, what exactly does make a rep meaningful? Well, if you remember from the first episode, the closer your reps get to muscular failure, the more challenging they become. And the more challenging they become, the longer they take to perform. This increase in concentric duration, or the time of the concentric, is a direct result of a decrease in concentric velocity, or the speed of the concentric. In other words, the reason your reps are taking longer to perform is because the speed at which you perform them is involuntarily slowing down. Even though you aren't deliberately stalling your reps, the weight has become so challenging that they start to slow down anyways, despite you still pushing as hard as possible. And this unintentional decrease in concentric speed is exactly what makes a rep meaningful. That's because as your concentric velocity goes down, the force produced by your muscle fibers actually goes up. This is known as the force-velocity relationship, which states that a muscle's ability to produce force increases as its contractile velocity decreases. And why is this important? Because it only happens when you're approaching failure. Think about it. If you do a set of 12 reps to failure, your first 5 to 7 probably aren't super difficult, and they're all pretty much the same speed with the same technique. But after a certain point, maybe after that 7th rep, the weight starts to feel super heavy and your tempo slows down significantly. Even though you planned on training to failure from the start, it was only those last 5 reps that really challenged you and required the most effort. These reps, where your concentric noticeably and involuntarily slows down, are called effective reps, since these are the ones that elicit the most muscle growth. Unlike the earlier reps in a set, effective reps are able to reach near maximum motor unit recruitment. And for those of you who don't know, a motor unit includes both a motor neuron, which is simply a nerve cell that sends a signal to the muscle from the brain, as well as all of the individual muscle fibers that actually receive that signal and perform movement. So when I say effective reps recruit the most motor units, I'm really saying that effective reps involve the most muscle fibers. And since hypertrophy occurs at the fiber level, meaning each fiber or cell grows on its own, involving more of them means stimulating more muscle growth. But I'll save all the hypertrophy talk for a future video. All you need to know for now is that when your concentric slows down, your muscles need to produce more force, and for that to happen, they need to recruit or involve as many muscle fibers as possible. This force that your fibers produce is called mechanical tension, and this is what leads to hypertrophy, or muscle growth. So to answer the original question, what classifies a rep as meaningful? The involuntary slowing of the concentric, since this is what produces mechanical tension. So now that we understand that, if we go back to the earlier example, where you did those 12 reps of bicep curls when you could have done 25, this would mean you did 0 effective reps, and that is why none of them were meaningful. Again, only those last 5 or so where your concentric involuntarily slows down are deemed effective, and because you stopped your set so far away from failure, you were never able to reach that point. So since the weight didn't challenge you, your muscles had no reason to recruit more fibers, and as a result, they never produced more force and thus didn't elicit any mechanical tension. So in the end, you never really stimulated any meaningful hypertrophy. So to prevent this from ever happening, you need to train close enough to failure to always ensure you actually include those effective reps in your set. To be more specific, every set you do in the gym that you hope to build muscle from needs to be within 0 to 4 reps from failure, as anything more and you won't have done any effective reps. So if you do a set of 10 when you could have done 15, you stopped your set 5 reps shy of failure, and as a result did 0 effective reps. However, if you did that same set for 14 reps, now you only stopped your set 1 rep shy of failure, and therefore you did 4 effective reps, your 11th through 14th. This 1 rep you left in the tank is called a rep in reserve, or RIR, as it's the amount of extra reps you could have done if you went to failure but didn't. So if you had 1 rep in reserve, you did 4 effective reps, and if you had 4 reps in reserve, you did 1 effective rep. And 0 reps in reserve usually means you completed your final rep but couldn't possibly do another one even if you tried, whereas failure would mean you didn't complete that final rep and stopped somewhere during the concentric. Both would equate to roughly 5 effective reps. So when you hear someone say that you should always train within 0 to 4 reps from failure, or reps in reserve, this is why. This then begs the question, if training closer to failure includes more effective reps, why not just train to complete failure every single time? Although that that would elicit the most mechanical tension and as a result stimulate the most muscle hypertrophy, it does unfortunately also create the most amount of fatigue. Think about it. If you did a set of squats for 8 reps and left 2 reps in reserve, chances are you're probably pretty fatigued, but you're still able to rest it off and do another set a few minutes later. However, if you did that same set for all 10 reps, leaving 0 reps in reserve, and push for an 11th, failing halfway through, you're probably way more fatigued, maybe even dizzy and nauseous, and forced to rest much longer as a result. Not to mention, if you actually gave it your all, then it's pretty likely you'll have to lower the weight for your next set in order to match the intensity. So even though those 2 additional reps may have created a bit more stimulus, since you now performed 5 effective reps instead of 3, all that extra fatigue it generates isn't always worth it. However, it still does have its advantages. So putting the fatigue aside, let's look at some of the pros. First, training to failure allows you to understand what vigorous intensity actually feels like. Pushing your body to its absolute limits is not a very easy task, and getting used to the feeling of discomfort is something you have to learn and practice over time so that you can actually understand what your body is truly capable of. You can't just expect to walk into the gym and take a set to failure if you've never done it before, and if you don't practice regularly, you'll never get used to that feeling. That's why it's extremely important for new or even intermediate lifters to establish this level of intensity early on in your training so that you can build that foundation and make the best use of your time. Number 2, training to failure eliminates the need for tracking reps in reserve. Because every set is to failure, you already know how many effective reps you performed. And for most people, accurately estimating that number if you don't train to failure is an impossible challenge. I'd argue that the majority of people who think they only had 2 to 3 reps in reserve probably had closer to 10. And in that case, you may think you've had a very productive session with a ton of effective reps when, as a matter of fact, you didn't do any. So if you just train to failure during every set in your workout, you prevent this from ever happening, as you no longer have to worry about precisely applying the right intensity. You can just train as hard as possible until you no longer can. Finally, number 3, training to failure allows you to get more stimulus by actually doing less. Since every set is pretty much yielding 5 effective reps, you won't need to do nearly as many sets as someone who doesn't train to failure in order to see similar results. Not to mention, if you're actually training to failure, then you won't even be able to keep up anyways, because your body will be so beat up from all of those individual exercises that you just couldn't possibly do as much as someone who trains with reps in reserve. And if you can, chances are you're not actually training to failure. Remember, failure is not an excuse for your form to get sloppy. You still need to use the exact same technique and tempo as your earlier reps, with the only exception being the speed of your concentric. And if you think you can do that for 15 to 20 sets a session, ask yourself, are you really training to failure, or are you just half-assing your reps when it gets difficult? If not, then expect your weekly volume to decrease. Again, that's not a bad thing, it's just something that has to happen if you always want to train to failure. That being said, you don't always have to train to failure. In fact, you technically never even have to if it's something you really hate doing. Again, as long as all of your working sets are at least close to failure or within 0 to 4 RIR, your muscles will produce mechanical tension and will grow as a result. So here are some of the advantages of not training to failure. First and most obvious, you won't have to go balls to the wall during every set in the gym. That doesn't mean you don't have to train hard. Training to failure is still incredibly taxing. It just means you don't have to literally fail on that last rep and spend the next 5 to 10 minutes reevaluating all of your life choices. As a result, you won't create nearly as much fatigue, both systemically and psychologically, which leads into the second benefit: you'll be able to do more sets in the gym. Because you won't be nearly as gassed as someone who does train to failure, and to compensate for not doing all 5 effective reps each time, you'll either have to do a few more sets per workout or train a bit more often throughout the week. And for most people, this is a huge win, since more time lifting weight usually means less time dealing with other people. Shifting over to some of the cons, you will unfortunately have to track reps in reserve, or at least have a somewhat accurate idea of how close to failure you actually are. The last thing you want is to stop your set early thinking you only left 2 reps in the tank, when in reality you actually left about 5. Again, thinking you're training close to failure is very different from actually training close to failure, and for most people, it can be very difficult to connect the two. So my personal recommendation is train to failure on some sets and train close to failure on others. That way, you understand what a true set to failure actually feels like, and subsequently how hard you need to push your future sets to be at least close to failure. Including both will also provide you with the highest amount of stimulus per the lowest amount of fatigue. Since doing all sets to failure creates the highest stimulus and highest fatigue, and no sets to failure the lowest stimulus, lowest fatigue, somewhere in the middle is most likely the sweet spot. And that is for you to find out on your own, because everyone is different and everyone has different goals and preferences in the gym, so what may work for you may not be the best option for someone else. Maybe that means going to failure on your last set, maybe that means only going to failure twice a week, whatever it is, and as long as all of your other sets are within 0 to 4 RIR, you will build muscle. So that wraps up training intensity. If you made it to the end of this video, then you're probably now wondering, if every set only includes about 5 effective reps, what's the point of doing anything more? And that will be covered in my next video, where I talk about how many reps should be in a set. So if you're interested in seeing that, as well as tons of other videos discussing volume, frequency, rest times, and so much more, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to show your support. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.